It was announced just the other day that CounterStrike, CSGO, will be one of the featured games in the 10th season of IEM, the Intel Extreme Masters, the premier esports brand run by ESL. Now, before we get into aspects of what this means, I want to start out with the most basic things that I thought of when I heard this news announced. So, first and foremost, ESL already has Counter-Strike Go, and they claimed one of their premier brands. They created this brand called ESL One, which was to represent basically games that weren't League of Legends or StarCraft 2. So the two big games, initially, it seems to have been created essentially to allow Dota 2 to be a premier game for them and not to be like representing on some lesser branding, and to make it seem like it was being treated equally as importantly as IEM, but while not being in IEM, so as to not have IEM have Dota 2 and League of Legends, which, for obvious reasons, if you know much about the scene and the politics of esports at the moment, is something which might displease or maybe even anger and upset Riot, who are the developers behind League of Legends, who have been much more controlling of tournament organizers, who they allowed third-party ones to be involved in their game since they're so proactive in it themselves. So it's been suggested, and even outright admitted in an interview I did with Carmack, that whether Riot asks you to or not, which I speculate, I think they probably do to a degree, or they at least have some element of influence on whether or not you have games like Dota 2 in your circuit, they certainly will be pleased if you tell them, like you sort of bend the knee and show allegiance to them and show fealty and say, hey, we're not going to have Dota 2 in that league. That league's just for you. The Intel, our premier brand, IEM, that's just for League of Legends. We won't have your direct competitor, Dota 2, in that. Dota 2 will have its own separate league. And then you go to Dota 2 and you say, no, listen, this is just as good as IEM. This is going to be the new IEM. This is going to be ESL 1, and that'll be our own special one. It's the premier, the number one brand. But Intel, if that's something special we do for Intel, listen, don't worry, we're still treating you with respect. Because initially, the uproar came around the fact, and I'm going to get to CSGO here, this ties into the story. Initially, what gets there is the fact that initially Dota 2 and CSGO were in the ESL Major Series. Before it became ESL 1, it was actually branded as ESL Major Series. And the way Major Series used to work within the ESL hierarchy is that this is for games that weren't on the level of IEM. They weren't the biggest and the best games. These were games that were just below that, or didn't have the following to warrant being in IEM, or just weren't as popular, weren't as important, but they wanted to be within the ESL system somehow, so they couldn't be in IEM. Only 2 or 3 games can be in there, so instead they were in the Major Series. And so initially CSGO started out with Dota 2 in the Major Series with its own events separate from IEM. So first and foremost, before we get into all that politics, because that's what a lot of this is going to be about, actually, because the context is very important to how it's come back. How Counter-Strike, it's the first time CSGO's in IEM, but Counter-Strike, the franchise, is returning to IEM and was one of the bedrocks on which IEM built its fame as one of the best circuits in the world, and how ESL took that crown as the number one organizer for a while, around, say, 2009. The premier major in Counter-Strike 1.6. The first question is, because of that context of them already having ESL 1 and having built it up as its own brand and being something special, so what is the benefit of Counter-Strike being in IEM? How is it going to be any different from ESL 1 Counter-Strike Global Offensive? I mean, presumably, this hasn't been actually outlined yet. It means that it won't be in both at the same time. There won't be ESL 1 events and IEM events. Is that the case? Because ESL 1 Katowice took place at the exact same time as IEM Katowice. So presumably you can't have a huge major in ESL 1 at the same time as your IEM World Championship. That is something that seems like a foregone conclusion, yet that wasn't outlined in this post. In this post, they don't mention that, and this means ESL 1 won't be continued for CSGO. There's actually, they almost go out of their way not to mention what would be a fairly obvious thing. That's one of the main criticisms I have of ESL, and a lot of organisers, but some of the others are a lot better at it. ESL tends to make these big, bold announcements like, hey, we're doing something awesome. And they're like, okay, you look through for the details, and there's just no details. Like, the first question you would ask them, like, so what's happening to ESL 1? Yeah, that's not mentioned. So which events are these games, is CSGO going to actually be featured in? Not mentioned. How will these events be structured? Will there be a circuit point system leading to the final? Not mentioned. How will this affect teams that, let's say, don't play in these leagues? Will they in some way be excluded from majors? Not mentioned. Will there be separate qualification just for the final, not just for the circuit tournaments? Not mentioned. No mention of any of the actual practical contextual info that would be the first things you would ask if this was a person speaking to you in real life, like, hey, I'm going to do this with IEM. So we're being broadcast this info, yet no real info. So that's one of the reasons why I have so many questions. So first and foremost, is it a circuit? Because previously, IEM and all the other games was a circuit. And winning those tournaments or placing top 2 gained you circuit point. Well, wherever you place gives you circuit point. But winning and placing top 2 gives you a very good chance in the old circuit in League of Legends and StarCraft 2 of qualifying for the big final. And the idea is the smaller events had smaller prize purses and in different places around the world. Then the big final is either in, well, in the past it used to be in Hanover in Germany, but now it's in Katowice in Poland. The idea is you want to qualify for that one because that's the one where it's got the big money for the final and you become a kind of a world champion. You become an IEM world champion if you win it. So that's an extra reason to want to play in these smaller circuit events, which in isolation might not be that great. So we saw in games like League of Legends, there was already a problem there where not that many top level teams did play in all the different circuits, and depending on the area they literally used to just play regionally based on that. Like even though teams from NA would probably win the tournament if it was in Brazil, most of them never travelled down there, never competed it, whether they were allowed to by Riot or not, and as a result the finals would end up with a decent field but nowhere close to comparable to a big tournament like, well, first of all, even a domestic league like an OGN or a big world championship. So will that happen here as well? Will it be a circuit around the world? But as a result, if you have a stop in China, if you had CSGO there, would it even be any Western teams? Would it be like second tier Western teams? Would it be mainly local teams and therefore you're going to qualify from teams from China? Because I don't really see a whole lot of benefit in that right now. The top 8 to 10 teams in the world are nearly all from Europe and then a couple from NA and then maybe Vox, but then there's no one else from the rest of the world that's significant. Key, I'm counting in NA there because they're in the NA scene at the moment. They're regionally competing there. So is the final going to have a huge first place? Because this is very important for the reason I just said. Because if you're talking about circuit and it's going to be separate events, the only real benefit to competing in the circuit is if the final has a lot of money and you want to play and win that. So you're trying to buy a ticket to the final by going to these circuits, which you're going to parlay if you're a Fnatic, a Virtus Pro, a TSM, an IP, into Envious, potentially winning the big major and getting like, who knows, 150k. Because first of all, as a circuit, it's hard to imagine, knowing the past of IEM, that these circuits will have significant prize money. At the moment, there are multiple lands every single month for CSGO on this particular run that have $20,000 or more first place and take place in Europe where the majority of the good teams are. So since the majority of this circuit takes place outside, actually about half of it takes place outside of Europe. There's one in China, there's one in San Jose, there's one in Asia that's unannounced yet, and then there's 2 in Cologne and 1 in Poland, but you have to qualify for the Poland one, obviously. 2 in Germany. So, okay, those 2, that's fine, as long as it's like 15k or more. I assume a bunch of teams will attend that, especially if there's circuit points. But if it's, say, 20k first place, why would someone attend that event over some other events that might be only a week later that they'd rather prepare for, that are in Europe already, or already have better teams there, or just seem like a better event overall in terms of prestige? Some of these events, they don't have. That's one of the things. When they used to have the old IEM circuit in 1.6, there weren't that many events at that point in time, like 2010 onwards especially. There were only, 6 to 8 big lands a year, and these circuit events were part of them. There weren't 1 to 2 big lands in Europe every month, and especially not with the same prize money and the same prestige. So it was significant. That's not the case anymore in CSGO. CSGO doesn't need more tournaments. We've already got easily enough tournaments. So if you bring a new tournament, you have to bring something new to the game. Like, for example, qualifying to a big major at the final where there's way more money, like maybe 200k first place. That would be a good reason to have a circuit. Otherwise, how does your individual circuit event compete with other tournaments that have as much money? Maybe you're in the final for another league, maybe even have more prestige at the moment because IEM hasn't built itself up again. Maybe even have better teams there, so it's going to be more competition. As a result, more prestige to win it. It's already better location in Europe where some of these events aren't. So that's an issue in itself. Now the finals, yes, if it's a circuit that builds into something, there's a reason to go to the finals anyway. But the finals need to be, at the minimum, a major. So this either has to be a much more complicated way of qualifying for a major, or they have to be more than a major. So they have to be like more than 100k first place. They have to be more than 250k total prize purse for the finals. Now that seems possible because in League of Legends, I think they had a final where, I know it was over 100k for first place in League of Legends in dollars. So maybe it was even 150, I forget. But I know it was over 100k, which is a very good amount. So, okay, if they can bring that to the table and deliver it, that's great. The final sounds excellent. But again, you're not really adding that much because if you have to then go through this circuitous, well, irony there, it's circuit approach to qualify, how have you added anything there? Haven't you just made it more complicated to qualify into this final in terms of teams having to turn down other events they'd rather go to, but to play this event here? Okay, so you can see where there's some problems coming in here. Ignoring that lot, the fact that there's tournaments in other countries isn't necessarily a good thing because, like I say, most of the best teams are in Europe and a couple in NA. So the events either have to be in NA, admittedly San Jose is, but this event in Asia, and if there was the one in China, if that had CSGO, I can see almost no reason aside from circuit points as to why any team from Europe, with all these lands in Europe, would waste time going to China or would even want to and have to put up with the food issues and different time zones and all these problems when they could just compete in Europe. So I don't know why they would want to do that. Finally, one thing that I think ESL's done a really poor job of here is announce the tournament circuit, but then not which games are featured at which tournaments. So it's very unlikely that CSGO is at every single stop here, because if it is, it's likely that some of those tournaments will be fairly poor. In fact, some of the worst of the year when you consider how many great European lands there have been already and are going to be for the rest of the year. So DreamHack, when they announced their tournament circuit, said at each stop which game would be where. What would there be at France? What would there be in Sweden? What would there be in Romania? Which game? CSGO, StarCraft 2? Is it just StarCraft 2? Is it CSGO? They announced all this information. Is Dota 2 the same weekend? They haven't done that here. They haven't announced any of these tournaments as having CSGO, but we know at least one must before the final. So if I had to guess, I'd probably say IEM Shenzhen, probably not, because there's not really any presence in China. And if you're going to have Chinese teams, I don't know who the fuck's going to watch that. I wouldn't. Also, I don't know how many teams would fly over there, and if they would, maybe some of them would be second-rate teams that fly over there, like a property type team might go, or a flip side, but it's very unlikely you're going to get the Fnatic, Envious, Virtus Pro, NIP, TSM lineup to go to an event in China, and it's so close, so I very much doubt that's going to happen. So immediately, the circuit isn't as good as it initially looks on paper, and it seems almost disingenuous to announce that CS is in IEM, and then list a bunch of events, list 6 events, including the final, and then not have CS at let's the majority of them. Like, it better be at 4 out of the 6, otherwise already why are you listing events that it's not even going to be at? What's the relevance there aside from to tell people what the circuit is? Now we get into the political stuff. Here's the problem. On the surface, there are positives to CS returning to IEM. I've mentioned some of them already. Adding a structure, maybe adding a bigger final, maybe having something unique about these circuit tournaments, that we have a reason to go to China and have a cool different environment and a different format, a different structure, which they don't mention, and then have it be a different amount of prize money and add in a little extra flavor to the scene. That would be great. There are downsides, though, and the downsides mainly come from the way ESL and ESL employees have treated the community and CounterStrike. So first and foremost, CounterStrike is pretty much the game that built IEM into the #1 organizer in the world for esports for a brief period of time, a couple of years. In the context of esports history, that's not actually that long. It's a couple of years, but it's pretty good. Pretty good run. Because, okay, they had Quake, they had other games, they had StarCraft, they had League of Legends eventually, they had World of Warcraft. These games all were part of the scene, but the one game that was present the whole time throughout the Counter-Strike seasons, it was up to season, I think season 7 was the last one that had Counter-Strike in it. Let me think, actually. No, season 6. Season 6 was the one that the ESC, the Polish players, Neo and Taz, they won that. That was the last one for Counter-Strike. So first 6 seasons. Counter-Strike was the mainstay, though, and it was always one that drew numbers, and it was always one, especially in Europe, at European events, that was very popular. And at the time, even in Asia, it would have some effect there, some kind of draw. In NA, it had fallen off a bit, okay, admittedly, and that's why some of their events in NA weren't that good, like the American Quad Championship, and that triggered them changing some of the rules on how they did their regional system into more of just a circuit like this, that's a general open circuit. So the problem is, Counter-Strike has always been a mainstay, has helped build them to this point, but then they abandoned Counter-Strike. They cut off CS 1.6, even though it would have had at least another year of a proper circuit and big numbers, because they said, okay, CSGO's coming out now, and people will want to support CSGO, and for the health of the scene in esports, everyone should move on to CSGO. But then they didn't give any of the help to CSGO. They didn't help CSGO grow. And they even made statements like Red Eye famously in an interview with Richard Lewis said, like, if CSGO was to get, I think it was said 100,000 viewers, then I'd be able to get it into IEM. How's CS going to get 100,000 viewers? In other words, enough viewers to warrant being on a big World Championship event when it doesn't have any big World Championship events. Think of the logic of that. So it's supposed to get World Championship numbers before it has a World Championship event to justify it and have all the accoutrements of that, and to have the resources and to have the circuit and to have things built up and have the storyline built up and have a central place that's well advertised. So without any of the factors which help you get the 100k and establish the 100k and maintain the 100k, grow the 100k, you're supposed to have it already. And then if something without any input and investment from them at all, they're just doing it in their major cities, the little secondary bitch league essentially, with them just doing it that way, it's supposed to fulfill every requirement, but with none of the help or things that help things grow. In which case, if it does with that miracle, then you'll be gracious and magnanimous enough to let it into your league once it's essentially fulfilled everything where you'd be an idiot not to let it in. And here's the thing, they didn't let it in IEM. Counter-Strike broke 100k, broke 300k, 400k, 500k. Supposedly the last event, the Katowice one, had 1 million viewers overall. And was it in IEM? Not at all. Now, why wasn't it in IEM? What happened since then? This is where we're going to get into the politics. So first and foremost, I have to introduce you to Carmack. And a lot of people in CSGO won't know that much about Carmack. He's mainly from the past of IEM, more well-known in StarCraft, more well-known in League of Legends. But he's just someone behind the scenes in ESL, and in general, he's not the person who interacts with the community. It's more the flying DJ, or Red Eye previously, because an obvious person to, or maybe Joe Miller now in terms of who's the community figure that we look to and look for clarification. But Carmack, at one point, his head title was product manager. He was in charge of kind of the general direction of ESL, and then obviously making some decisions also on maybe hiring of which people are hired and having some say in the philosophy. And that's one of the key things about Carmack, because his personality, at least the way he's marketed himself and spoken about himself in interviews, is he always essentially tried to put himself in a role that sounded like a kind of wannabe Steve Jobs role. So think of Steve Jobs when he was the CEO of Apple. The key thing was he didn't necessarily individually go down and actually solder in like an iPod or specifically tell someone, oh, and I want to use this technology. It was more the general philosophy, the ethos of the company, what philosophy informs, as in how we think things should be, how life could be, how the world would ideally operate, and then taking that philosophy and finding a way to transfer it and to implement it within how the company acts day to day and in bigger aspects and in structural concepts and how they deal with rules and policies. This is one of the areas where he was set up as this was part of his job, and he's always presented all changes within IEM, beneficial or negative, however you perceive them, as being a result of initial philosophy, which stays the same in theory, your philosophies, the things that you think matter, and then the rules come out of that. But that's where I've always been very suspicious, because by keeping a track of how these policies change and how ESL, depending on market forces, at times just goes completely 180 and wishy-washy, it seems the other way around. It seems to me that Carmack is just a good talker, and what he does is he takes whatever policy he either wants to or has to enact now and reverse engineers a philosophy out of it which would justify it, and then tries to claim that either a change in philosophy or this philosophy always being the case is why the policy happened. When actually, if you look at the chronology, it seems incredibly likely that it was the other way around, that he just reverse engineered so that it was politically expedient for this now to be the new policy, and it wasn't actually based on his philosophy. And sometimes he's changing his entire mind and things that he held as very important core values, and maybe even promised in the future things would be this way. And so you have to start off with Dota 2 before you get to CSGO, because at the time CSGO wasn't that big in terms of numbers, so maybe it didn't entirely justify it. But Dota 2 right off the bat was very big. It wasn't as big as League, but it was right there as a solid second or third option. And so if you're having the top 3 games as your circuit, Dota 2 definitely has to be in there. Not could be in there, has a debate, has reasons that you could say it should be in there. It has to be in there. If you're really going to make this the best league with the best gamers and the best players, because remember, the whole tagline of IEM was world's best gamers. Well, why isn't Dota 2 in there? Are they not the world's best gamers? It's not one of the world's best games? Of course it is. So that's immediately suspicious that it's not in the league. Now, one of the reasons I did a long interview with him, a 2-part reflections interview with Carmack, it's on the On Gamers site, you can go find it. And I asked him about this because the thing is, since Dota 2, made by Valve, is a direct competitor even within the MOBA/arts market with League of Legends, the biggest game in that sector and the biggest game in esports at the time anyway, especially in terms of numbers and popularity, it looks suspicious that Dota 2 isn't included in IEM, the best circuit, the premier brand for ESL, because of the fact that it's known behind the scenes that in the past, Riot has attempted contractually and through direct influence to try and influence or outright mandate that tournament circuits didn't feature Dota 2 in the same circuit under the same brand as League of Legends. Otherwise, they wouldn't cooperate, or they would outright take some kind of action, or maybe they wouldn't even be allowed to feature League of Legends there. So there's definitely been pressures from Riot in the past. This is talking years ago. Now, whether it continues, maybe they've done a better job at it. I haven't got any hard proof to say it does, so I won't say it will. I won't speculate in that scenario. But it certainly seems as though that basis, that precedent set by Riot before, at least means that teams now, or organizations now, think to themselves, well, there's no point ever doing that because you can upset Riot that way. It might be more difficult to deal with Riot. Riot might not give you their LCS teams or allow you to run tournaments, or might make it harder for you, or might not give you the same level of exposure on their avenues of marketing, etc., and let you have their casters, or give you the prize money, because that's a key thing for IEM that changed from the CSGO era. Or give you the prize money, which is what Valve wasn't going to do for CSGO. They might not do all those things if you include Dota 2, which they see as a direct rival, competitor, whatever. And so What Carmack said in the interview was one of the reasons why Dota 2 isn't in IEM, for all these good reasons I gave. His counter to that was that essentially, in terms of developers, Riot is his best customer. They're someone who's doing a lot for his brand. In the past of IEM, before the League of Legends era, IEM used to have to, ESL would go, get all these sponsors, including Intel as the key sponsor, get the prize money from those people, and get the money to run the events from those people, run the events, give out the prize money from Intel, and that's the way they would represent a market for Riot, Intel rather. But along came the era when people like Riot, like World of Warcraft apparently maybe, were able to buy into it. And maybe in the case of Riot, well, apparently it was the case that he said early on when they were initially including League of Legends that they actually paid the prize money. They provided the prize money. So all those thousands of dollars and millions that ESL had to previously figure out a way to get from sponsors and do very good partnership management with, now they're just getting from the developers. So it's making their life easier. It's making it a lot more stable for them. And now Riot's paying for things like maybe teams to fly to events. Maybe they're providing their own casters to do the events at the time. All these extra benefits of working with Riot. So he essentially presented it as, these are my best customer. They're doing a lot for my brand. They're doing a lot for esports. They're doing a lot for League of Legends. They're doing a lot for IEM. Why would I anger them or disrespect them or upset them by including Dota 2? Now, I could go into my whole entire rant about the fact that I think that way of phrasing it is incredibly disrespectful to esports as a whole. The idea that just because Riot has the most money and will give you a lot, that now it would be disrespectful to esports to have Dota 2, one of easily the world's best brands, under your premier brand, which has the title World's Best Gamers. I'd say you're disrespecting those gamers and that game by not including that in IEM. But ignore that for a second. The point here is, this is one reason he gave as to why you wouldn't include a game like Dota 2 alongside League of Legends. Now, CSGO isn't obviously a direct competitor to League of Legends in the MOBA/arts genre. Now, as an esport, it's becoming that because it's becoming very popular, and maybe there's even crossover more so than Dota 2 in terms of fans of people who watch League of Legends will watch CSGO. So if those events went head-to-head, maybe there would be an issue there. Now, with that said, a key factor that shouldn't be ignored is that CSGO is owned, the copyrights, by Valve, who are also the company who own Dota 2. So again, in a way, if you put CSGO in IEM, aren't you helping a competitor company of Riot? Yes, not the same game genre, but you're disrespecting them and allowing them to have, even though Riot's giving you all these things, you're now giving them space and giving them attention on the same event and putting them alongside it, even though maybe they aren't giving you the same amount of money that Riot is. Or are they? There's an interesting question to ask, but we don't get any of these answers. So there was that reason. And then there was also a reason he gave, which is he said, in terms of Dota 2, you need 5 PCs because it's a 5-man game, just like League of Legends. And so since it's another 5-man game, you can't have that at IEMs because you've already got League of Legends. You can't have Dota 2. There's only so many PCs. It's hard to transport PCs to an event. First of all, that didn't fly with me whatsoever, because if that's the case, if you want it to be world's best gamers, your priority should be having the world's best games. Then you figure out the logistics afterwards. You don't go, right, well, I've decided I've booked this event. I've spent this much on this and I've this much on this. And so at the end, I've realized I can't have enough computers there, so I can't have that game. That doesn't really add up to me there, mate, because you could have it in a country where things are cheaper to hire. You could have less events, or you could have events in certain areas where you know you can get deals on the PCs, or you could have the separate events where you have League of Legends at one and then you have Dota 2 at the other one. So you're having only the same amount of PCs, but they're able to be used. Also, the idea that PCs are super expensive when you've got these kinds of sponsors and this kind of budget is rather ridiculous. Oh, and should I include that during Season 6, you had League of Legends and you had CounterStrike. 2 5v5 games, both need 5 PCs for each team in the same circuit at the same events. So that historically doesn't make sense. So in the past you could afford it, but now you can't afford it in a modern day where someone's providing even more money to your cause. Now a developer's paying more and things are growing. You're getting more sponsors. Intel's growing. ESL's growing. The circuit's growing. Surely IEM's getting bigger and better. And now you can't afford what you could afford in the past. Doesn't add up. Now, the problem here is that CS is a 5v5 game, just like Dota 2 is a 5v5 game. So what's changed? Surely something epic and monumentous must have taken place that before they couldn't have 2 5v5 games, but now with CSGO and League of Legends in ESL, they're going to have, in IEM rather, they're going to have 2 5v5 games. So what's changed? What amazing thing has happened in esports at ESL or from Intel that has now allowed them to be able to transport 5 extra PCs per team for CSGO that they couldn't with Dota 2? I can't see any possible reasons. That sounds, again, like not necessarily a lie, but a disingenuous way of phrasing something you wanted to do anyway, but you reverse engineered as you had to do it, you had no choice, and maybe it was even impossible to do the way other people wanted. So there's one reason. Don't want to upset Riot, can't have that many PCs because it's a 5v5 game, not a 1v1 game. What's the third reason? We were told last year in an interview with On Gamers also, not by myself, with Travis Gafford, a well-known League of Legends journalist, that CSGO didn't fit into the IEM framework due to IEM being an international, a worldwide leader, remember the world's best gamers, and CSGO, quite correctly, does not have a presence, a significant presence in terms of esports, in Southeast Asia or China. And these are areas where they're going to have events. They're going to have events in China, maybe Shanghai, Shenzhen, you can see now. Maybe they're going to have events Beijing, maybe they're going to have events in Taipei, Hong Kong, Singapore. These are viable routes. Now, in these places, CSGO does not have any significant contextual relative presence, and on a worldwide scene, it has next to no presence, very, very little presence. That's absolutely right. Here's the problem. That hasn't changed. Nothing has changed about that in terms of numbers or presence or significance or events held there since he made these comments last year. Nothing has changed. So if that was a reason keeping CSGO out of IEM, then CSGO shouldn't be in IEM right now. None of those things have changed. So again, that apparently wasn't a real philosophy which informed the policy, because the philosophy hasn't changed and the facts haven't changed, and yet the policy's changed. So what philosophy is now informing this policy? Because at the end of the day, that was never that valid a reason anyway. Yes, all the teams are in Europe, and a lot of the viewer base is in Europe and NA, but those teams and those viewer base, if you provide the right events and you put them on at the right times, will go to those other countries, will go to where you have the tournament, and will watch the tournament, much as they did in the past. Even if local viewing numbers were higher in the past in 1.6, also the world essentially followed the tournaments, and the shifting eye of the tournaments, as long as it's in the right time zone, went to wherever it was. Essentially, we bring the show to you. I mean, if I went the other way around and looked at the history of ESL and said, oh, this event's going to be held in Leipzig, so let's look, how relevant is Leipzig on a worldwide scale? Because unless the local people in Leipzig are going to watch, then you shouldn't hold this tournament there, because, you know, shouldn't be a different game that Leipzig cares about. Like, that would be a ludicrous way to do it, because esports is an international thing where 99% of the viewers are on the fucking stream, not in person. Therefore, that's really not as relevant. As long as you have a shot that looks like it has a crowd, 99% of the people are on stream, and they're the people you should be taking care of. And that's the thing. In the past, okay, the game was through HLTV.org, similar thing to streaming, but okay, a live crowd might be more important then. It's not as important now. Overwhelmingly, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are watching on stream. At most, 15,000, usually more like 1,000 or 2,000 are watching in person. They shouldn't be the ones catered to here. So again, none of these conditions have really changed. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense how these philosophies have changed to enact a totally different policy, and now magically CSGO's in IEM. So they said that one of the problems with the presence there is it didn't allow them to use IEM to the fullest, and that IEM's logistically limited because they only have one stage, so they can't have multiple games being played there. Well, that's funny, because they not only had IEM games being played on one stage in Katowice, but as far as I know, they also had ESL 1 games being played for CSGO on the same stage as IEM and had to be scheduled around. As far as I know, I'm not an expert on this. So apparently that, again, didn't prove to be true, even within the context of IEM and ESL 1. So what's changed about that now? What amazing things happened when now they've been able to treble the stages, double the stages, or else they're all just disingenuous again? Are we really going to have it all on one stage? It turns out you just didn't want to do that. You could have done it, but you didn't want to. Or has ESL magically, hey, you'd think with the way ESL brags about every number and stat, that if Intel had doubled down and given them twice as much money or 4 times as much money, or Valve had given them $1 million on the side, I don't think they'd keep that secret and then be able to do all these things logistically that they were apparently handicapped or limited from doing logistically before. I think they'd be bragging about getting millions or having a new partnership, a stronger investment, and looking forward to the growth of IEM and esports. I don't think they'd keep that secret. Therefore, it suggests to me that this was a disingenuous way of doing it. So at the end of Carmack's statement in that interview, he said, therefore, due to logistical and geographical features, we created ESL 1 for games like Dota 2 and CSGO. Now, what's funny is, knowing the political context, once I found that out about League of Legends and the PCs and all that shit, I actually thought this is pretty clever, actually. You make a separate brand, but then because it had the history of being a secondary brand, which was disrespectful, you make it another premier brand. You make it, hey, we're ESL, but we put on 2 different premier brands. We have ESL 1 and we have IEM. And you know IEM's about StarCraft 2 and League of Legends, so you're going to learn that Dota 2 and CSGO is ESL 1. That's fine. They did create an equally good brand. But in that case, why get rid of ESL 1? Why would you change it? I mean, like you're saying, logistic and geographical features haven't changed as far as I know. If they have, why haven't you told us? Therefore, why would you abandon ESL 1 now? Why is that brand no longer going to be the premier one? Why is it going back to ESL being, and IEM being the main focus and the world's best gamers and all that shit? So the Fly DJ's statement about this 1 year ago, when people noticed that it wasn't going to be in the 9th season, CSGO, is he said, CSGO is growing, and we believe that it should be part of the best fitting tournament product we have for it. ESL 1 is exactly that. Now, for whatever reasons, ESL 1 was the best fitting tournament product they had for CSGO. Why has it changed? What factors have changed to stop that being the best feature? Because as far as I can tell, if that was a good brand, and it was, then nothing's changed that it should now be in IEM. Now, what has changed? What are the real reasons? If I had to speculate, which I have to because they're not giving me any information here, and I don't see them doing interviews with people where people are allowed to ask these questions. Here's what I would suggest has changed. They didn't know that CSGO would get huge. Here's the thing, Dota 2 was never going to overtake League of Legends. Therefore, pleasing Riot and League of Legends to a degree made sense. And okay, then, as Dota 2 got big, you don't want to upset Dota 2 by it being in the secondary league, so you make its own full league and say, no, we just have 2 Premier Leagues here. And one's for that stuff, but the other one, ESL, is just as good, and we're going to build that up and have it in real stadiums and show it's legitimate. They did a great job with that. So that took care of Dota 2 and League of Legends. And we know it makes sense in a way that they won't be, that you can't mix those two together. It's just not going to work politically in terms of expedience in the esports industry and amongst those two companies. And it's true, Riot's giving you more money than apparently Valve is, so Riot are the ones who probably do deserve to be given priority treatment if they demand it, and they do seem like a high-maintenance customer, but who also bring more to the table. So with that said, for Dota 2 it makes sense, but here's the problem. ESL didn't ever account for CSGO's growth. No one did, but ESL especially were in a bad situation. Because people like DreamHack, because it had built DreamHack as well, CSGO, CounterStrike rather, and had been a part of their history, they didn't abandon CS. In fact, they tried to make it still a main one of their games, and they still put in a lot of money to it, and they still tried to put on a big show, and they were one of the first to have proper analyst desks with Lurpis and Red Eye, etc. Actually, back in 2012, when there wasn't even a sniff of a major, and no one knew that was coming. They were still putting on, trying to progress the esports of CounterStrike in their limited budget that they could. So always respectable. And as a result, when CSGO then got huge, and remember the first major was DreamHack Winter 2013, no one had any ill will because they were in prime position. They'd put in all the work, they'd invested, and now when they got the fruits of that, you were like, great, that makes total sense. You never went away from CS, you never betrayed it in any sense, you never made it seem lesser or less important or took it away from your primary brands and did something separate with it. And now that it's grown great, everyone loves this. We love you, DreamHack. When ESL had the whole major series going on, eventually they had to fix that for Dota 2. And at the same time, luckily for them, was when CSGO was getting big and they could just elevate CSGO once majors started to exist. Remember, the first one was an EMS. EMS won Katowice, was 2014. ESL Major Series won Katowice. It wasn't even their premier brand. ESL 1 wasn't there at the time, and this wasn't as big as IEM, even though logistically it was. It didn't have the prestige value of the name. They didn't have the brand. It wasn't the product. But eventually, they did the smart thing and made it part of ESL 1, and they made ESL 1 the new brand, and now CSGO had its own premier brand. Now, what I think happened was, CSGO is so overwhelmingly grown, so Dota 2 was there, but it was always going to be a firm second, that CSGO might yet be the biggest in terms of just the pure esports, not the number base or the money generated. Riot and League of Legends will probably always succeed there, World of Tanks probably. But in terms of an esports prestige, number of people watching to number of people playing and outside the scene and germination, cross-pollination from other scenes, StarCraft 2 people watching, Dota 2 people watching, League of Legends people watching, all into CSGO, this attention, where it's kind of a neutral ground where people can come from all these games without the Dota 2 versus League battle. In this sense, it's so exponentially grown and seems to be getting bigger all the time that this is where it caused a problem for ESL, in my estimations, which is the one person we've left out of this discussion so far. We've talked about catering to Riot, catering to the fans of Dota 2 and CSGO, and the developer of League of Legends, and ESL and IEM's own logistical and geographical concerns, and how to put their own products out there. We've talked about catering to all these people. Who haven't we talked about catering to in the Intel Extreme Masters? Tagline, world's best gamers. Intel. Now, they seem like a very important customer to keep happy within the IEM context. Forget Riot and the games. Without Intel, there is no IEM. First of all, if you even had to change sponsor, oh my god, we can't call it IEM for a start off, and that would be a massive overhaul. So the one person above all others you must keep happy is Intel. Now, if I was Intel, when I first started into this IEM project, and over the years I've been giving more and more money, and I've been, at one time, the best league in the world. So I could always say to my people at Intel, like if I'm the esports manager, like, hey, we have the premier brand. We've overtaken ESWC, overtaken WCG. We are the number one brand within this circuit of esports, this tournament field, and our money's well placed here. And we're getting excellent exposure. If someone then comes to me and says, hey, what about this CSGO game? It's growing exponentially, it's growing rapidly, but it's not in our league. I thought we had the world's best gamers. I thought we had the best circuit. I know we had StarCraft 2, which was big a few years ago. We have League of Legends, which is still huge. I know we don't have Dota, but maybe we can understand that has some problems there. Why haven't we got the CSGO game in there? Why is CSGO in this other league that was built up separately, ESL 1, and yet it's the same company that we're paying all this money towards to do IEM and brand us as the best tournament organizer and best sponsor in the world? Why isn't it in our league? So that's why I think all this philosophy and all these reasons, which none of the conditions have changed for, and if these really were true philosophies and beliefs and integrity and integral concepts to IEM and Steve Jobs, wannabe Carmack, and all these people at ESL, then these wouldn't have changed. Therefore, the policy wouldn't have changed for no reason, without any reason given. I think what changed was the big guy with the big money, the purse strings, said, hey, listen, I want to be part of CSGO. I want CSGO in my league. I want my league again to be the number one focus for you. I want it to be the most important. I want it to be the premier brand. I want it to be the world's best gamers. And so if people are telling me that CSGO is this huge game with some of the best players in the world, I need to have the world's best gamers. It has to be into IEM, has to have CSGO. And so it's not the same as Dota 2. There's not going to be the same concerns from Riot, perhaps, but there was more leverage and more influence than a Riot or something like that could provide, or even fans of CSGO and players of the organizations from Intel. So to me, that's the reason why I suspect as to why CSGO has returned to the IEM. Now, as a final note, yes, it's good that CS is in IEM. To a degree, like maybe it means more tournaments, therefore more opportunity, more teams can play. Maybe the international aspect means we'll get a little bit more international play, where in a legitimate sense they can play in some tournaments, even though it won't be quite as good to me as if they played in European tournaments with the best teams. But okay, maybe these things are good things. But I'm not entirely over the moon because we already have a fantastic circuit. ESL 1 to me was already a brilliant brand. And okay, if I believe the premise of all those other circumstances, it had already carved out its own niche. And I can't see what benefits IEM is going to bring over ESL in a lot of these senses. I think it was disrespect. Here's the problem. Here's the gist of it. It's good that CS is in IEM, but here's the problem. I'm not going to give you a round of applause because it always should have been in IEM. For the reasons I've outlined here, the reasons you gave, ESL, were disingenuous, sometimes outright lies, at times just purposely stretching the truth and being disingenuous about what your real motivations were or why you wanted to do things this way. It was also literally bowing and sacrificing one game, it's seen its prestige for a while into the major series for the sake of one game that gave you the most money and had the most viewers, and literally saying, in a way, yeah, I'll always prioritize them over you because they've got more money than you. I mean, that's not the basis for me, what esports is built off. But anyway, so it's a bit disrespectful. And then you've built up ESL 1, but what? For naught. Now it's going into IEM, is it? What? So that was all just a bigger joke, and now we've seen the transparency of that. Who were you tricking there with ESL 1? What? Us, the people in esports. We were the ones tricked into think that was a premier brand that was going to go on for years, and this was going to be its own legit brand. But now magically it's not going to be in that game anymore? Is that just going to be Dota 2? Seems a bit dodgy. And then also the idea that the IEM tagline was always like world's best gamers, and you didn't have the world's best gamers. Instead, you had like a team from Turkey and a team who's like the second or third best team in Russia competing in an IEM for League of Legends, while teams like NIP, Very Games, TSM, etc. are competing on a world stage as some of the best teams in the world, amazing gamers in CounterStrike, but they don't get to be part of your premier brand of your world's best gamers. They aren't included in the world's best gamers, apparently. This is a cross-section of world's best gamers, bracket, that Riot allows to compete at events, and we haven't got that many PCs anyway, and you have to be also quite big in China, and all these reasons. I mean, by the way, I could go down this list and show you that games like StarCraft 2 did not meet all this criteria. Games in StarCraft 2 did not have the same presence in some of these Asian areas as CounterStrike would in terms of the numbers it would have brought on stream. That's just factual in terms of the last year or so. So the philosophy never fit. And so that's my general thoughts. But a lot of criticism there. In general, some good aspects. But at the moment, it's hard to give too much credit because a lot of the good aspects are things I've had to speculate about. There's no details given on the circuit, the structure of it, the prize money, what the implications are for the two brands, ESL and IEM, how this will affect other tournaments within that space. Will you have to play in it? Will it be open? Will the final be a major? Will this affect majors all being under the IEM brand? There's so many questions to be asked and answered here. And I don't know who's going to ask them because I don't see a lot of our interviews and a lot of forthcoming aspect. I feel like ESL purposely withholds this information so that they can control how people perceive and essentially gain public kudos and applause for letting people think things are going to be one way and only having to tell them, oh, it wasn't going to be that way at the last minute when they've already gotten all the exposure and all the kind of plaudits, and then at the last minute they kind of, it's not actually going to be like that, and people are like, oh, okay, but it's too late then. You've already gotten all the fucking standing ovations and people like, yeah, yes, ESL, the conquerors coming in. No, they're here to liberate us. So yeah, CS returns to the IEM.